Gogdina August Falchagadi, a call of Brehon. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Brehon Academy. My name is Kevin Flanagan, and tonight we're going to continue our journey into a story of an Irish sept written by Nottige Charles Macnamara in 1896. This is going to cover chapter 2 of the book, which deals with the law and society of the early Irish, with a particular focus on the Bretton Laws of early Ireland, which is one of my favorite topics. And followers of this channel, I think, are really going to enjoy the content that we cover in chapter 2. Just to do a little recap of what we've covered so far. This book was written in 1896, and the full title is A Story of an Irish Sept and Their Struggle to Maintain Their Lands in County Clare. Now, a sept is a word used in Ireland to describe sort of a confederation of clans. Many different groups of families that are joined together by kin from a common ancestor. And in this case, the Macnamaras are part of the Dalcassian sept. This is also the sept or clan or tribe, I'll use these words interchangeably, from which the O'Briens descend through the great High King of Ireland, Brian Boru. In the chapter 1, he talks about the origins of the sept, which he links to the Basques of the Iberian Peninsula on both sides of the Pyrenees. I want to be specific about this because I think it's important. The Basque people do not like to be called people who come from the north of Spain because, as they point out in the article that I read in the previous video, Spain did not exist at the time the Basque people did. And I kind of liken this to how Irish people do not like to be referred to as coming from the British Isles, which I hear a lot, not living in Ireland at the moment, traveling around Europe and different parts of the world over the last 4 or 5 years. I've heard this a lot, and Irish people don't really like it. So in chapter 1, he gives a lot of different reasons for why he believes it's valid to make this connection between the Basques and the early Irish, particularly those who are inhabitants of the west of Ireland and the Aran Islands. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that because you can always go back and watch chapter 1 video that's up on my channel. But because of the topics that were covered in it, and it raised a lot of questions in the comments, I decided it made sense to go a little bit deeper into these topics. And I made a follow-up video to that, an addendum to chapter 1 called Who Were the Fear Bolgs? So if you're interested in getting up to speed and all of that, I'd suggest after this video to go back and watch those other videos. In the addendum, I analyzed this idea of, is it right, the claims that Macnamara makes to come to that conclusion. One of the claims was that he compared the types of skulls found in early Ireland, in early Irish graves, to that of the Basque region. That might not be the strongest claim to make, and some people raised that in the comments, and that was a fair point to raise. But it wasn't the only claim that he made. He also likened the early Irish, particularly of Western Ireland, to the Basques, according to how they look in their stature, the color of their hair, that they were short, that they were brown haired, generally blue-eyed or gray-eyed. And he also made a lot of parallels to their character, the nature of these people, and how they were similar to that of the Basque, that they loved justice, that they were adhered to the land on which they were born, and nothing, not promotion or payment, could convince them to abandon their ancestral lands. They also clung dearly to their ancient customs and ancient rights, which was something that the Irish did for a long time, until eventually, sadly, they were conquered. A large part of my work deals with what I think of as the Gaelic Era of Ireland, which I class up until around the 1600s, which is when we had the Battle of Kinsale and the flight of the Earls. And shortly after that, we had the new planters, the Tudor conquests, the penal laws. And it was really in that period from the early 1600s onwards up until the War of Independence that we see the erosion of Irish culture, Gaelic identity, to the point where very few Irish people, including myself, are even able to speak the language of our ancestors. And that's quite sad. And it becomes all the more apparent just how sad that is when we look at the history of Ireland, kind of within a context, to kind of look at it, take a long view, but also kind of condensed into a single story. And this is why I really love this book, A Story of an Irish Sept, because it tells that story of Ireland, but focusing on a single clan, a single sept, a single tribe. And while this is very specific to the Dalcassians and the Macnamaras and the O'Briens and their kindred, similar stories could be said pretty much of any clan from early Ireland. So in this chapter, we're going to move things forward a bit. We've looked at the origins in chapter 1. I did an addendum to that to go a little bit deeper into the ideas and motifs that come out of that conversation. Chapter 2 is going to move into a more familiar, I think, part of Irish history, which is going to deal with the laws and society of early Ireland. We're going to look at the Brehon laws and consider their pre-Christian origins. We're also going to be introduced to St. Patrick and consider his role in, I guess you could say, codifying the Brehon laws. And what I mean by that is writing them into manuscripts. So we consider the kind of Irish era of writing to begin after the Christians came to Ireland, which was in 432 AD. But what's really interesting is the 9 people who were assembled to compile the Seancasmór, or Seancasmór, the great ancient law code. Seancas means something that's like ancient or old, and mór means big or great. So the Seancasmór is the great ancient law code. And even though St. Patrick, as a Christian, and 3 bishops were involved in the codifying of this law, we will learn in this chapter that most of the other people who were there working on this codification, including 3 kings and 3 learned men, were pagans, and they clung to their pagan beliefs. So the question remains, to what extent were they, quote unquote, Christianized? But it's an interesting topic to consider anyway. We'll also look at the law of distress, which is a very important part of the Brehon law, and also of fasting for justice. We'll spend about a minute only talking about the bee judgments, the Brehon law concerning the ownership of bees. And then we'll move on to the nature of the tribe and the chief, how land was divided among the family. We'll talk about marriage and divorce, children, fosterage. We'll also talk about the guilds, which is a fantastic idea, which actually has a lot of merit in today's society as well. The guilds were associations of either farmers or craftsmen who joined together in an association in order to pool their wealth, but also in order to establish a stronger legal identity within society. And that's a very interesting topic, an aspect of early Ireland that definitely merits more investigation than Macnamara goes into in this chapter. And finally, we'll close up with a discussion on the houses that they lived in, the type of clothes that they wore, and the food that they ate. And I would say that this is a relatively short synopsis, considering we're talking about a pretty large span of time and a pretty dense topic. But it's a very nice synopsis on the Brehon law and early Irish society. But if you want to go deeper into this, please go and check out the online courses on the brehonacademy.org, especially in terms of early Irish culture and society. The online course there on that topic will go a lot deeper and into a lot more intrinsic detail than Macnamara covers in this chapter. And that's especially so of the course on the Bretton Laws of early Ireland. I really would emphasize that what Macnamara talks about, is a very short teaser and synopsis that tries to give the reader a kind of an introductory taste of the nature and society of early Ireland under the Bretton Laws. So if you want to go deeper into that, please check out the online courses. Also, you can download this book on the brehonacademy.org resource library. There's over 100 resources there, different PDF books that I have collected over the years and made available to all of the members on the brehonacademy.org. it is free to join. You just go to the become a member section, scroll down to the basic member, click to sign up, put in your details, and then you'll be able to access and download all of the content in the members library, and that will be free forever. Search for A Story of an Irish Sept, and you can download the book there. Before I jump into this, I just want to say a big thank you to the few people who chipped in on the last video and gave a super chat. That is really appreciated. That was users on YouTube, Risen Ability, Fionn, and a channel called Clans and Dynasties. And I would suggest to check out that channel as well, Clans and Dynasties. If you like the content that I cover here, you're going to love the content that they cover over there. I'm hoping that we can have some future collaboration, because there's definitely a lot of overlap in the content that I cover and what they have on their channel. So Clans and Dynasties channel on YouTube, give that a check out as well. My mission with all of this is quite ambitious, but also quite simple. I am just trying to open a conversation and bring information to people so that it maybe sparks something inside of them. Sort of like, I used this metaphor before, that Irish culture and history and our connection to it, it's kind of like a fire that has almost gone out, but the embers are still burning in this fire. And if we just blow on these embers, gently blow, and start adding a little bit of fuel to them, then maybe a new fire will begin to burn, one that has a relevance for today's society, one that can maybe be a guiding light into this very uncertain future that we're all facing at the moment. And I really thank all of you for being here on this journey with me. One of the things I hear quite often, actually, when it comes to the Brehon Law and people rediscovering the Brehon Law, a phrase I hear is they say, I felt like a homecoming, like it stirred something inside me, something familiar but distant. And that's really what I hope the Brehon Law, the Brehon Academy, should I say, can be at this time. And I really am grateful for every single one of you who are on this journey as well. So without further ado, let's begin the next chapter, Chapter 2 of A Story of an Irish Sept, and their struggle to maintain their lands in Clare, by Nottige Charles Macnamara, published in 1896. The Story of an Irish Sept, Chapter 2, on the Brehon Code, pre-Christian Ireland, derived from Aryan sources, the Brehons, their office, the law of distress, fasting on a plaintiff, homicide punished by a fine, the Bee judgments, the tribe, the Sept and chief of the ancient Irish, the election of the chief, conjoint family, division of land among its members, repartition of land, parents and children, fosterage, guilds, dwelling, furniture, dress, and food. The Brehon Code regulated the various ranks of society among the early Irish, from the king to the serf, and in this code of laws we find the rights and privileges of each grade of society, the management of property, size of the dwellings, and rules and regulations governing the relations of the individuals concerned in every step of life, from the cradle to the grave. Much of this work was elaborated before the commencement of the Christian era. It was committed to memory and handed down from one generation of Bretons to another. These laws were not enacted by a legislative body. They were, as stated in the earliest compilation we possess of the Brehon Code, the consensus of opinion of the people as to what was right and what was wrong in the conduct of human affairs. They are said to, quote, contain the judgments of true nature, that is, what men might know and should be obliged unto by the mere principle of reason imposed by consideration and experience. End quote. And from the footnote, the law of nature is that which is so exactly fitted to suit with the rational and social nature of man that human kings cannot maintain an honest and peaceful fellowship without it, or, in other words, that which carries in it a natural goodness, or a usefulness arising from its internal efficacy towards man in general. Though there be, also, a further reason of this denomination, inasmuch as law may be found out and known by the ordinary sagacity of man and from the consideration of human nature in common. Positive law is that which does not by any means flow from the general condition of human nature, but from the sole pleasure of the lawgiver, though these laws ought likewise to have their reason and their uses in reference to that particular society for which they are enacted." End quote. From The Law of Nature and Nations by Basil Kent. Returning to the text, these laws were doubtless modified as the wants of society developed, and from the earliest times until the reign of James I of England, the Bretton Laws remained in full force in Clare and other parts of the west of Ireland, and necessarily exercised a great influence on the social and political life of the people. There is abundant evidence to demonstrate the fact that these Brehon laws derived from, or rather the product of the people, were not only just but were effective in administering to the evils they were intended to control in a society such as that which existed in Clare until the close of the 16th century. Soon after the introduction of Christianity into Ireland in AD 432 by St. Patrick, it was determined to commit the Brehon laws to writing, expunging from them what was contrary to the precepts contained in the New Testament. Otherwise, these laws were confirmed by the Brehons and by St. Patrick. Quote, "For the law of nature had been quite right, except the fate and its obligations and the harmony of the church and the people." End quote. This was the opinion of the 9 persons appointed to draw up this important work, which has come down to us in the form not long since translated into English under the authority of government. From the footnotes, 9 persons were appointed to arrange and revise the Brehon laws: Patrick and Benin and Kernick, 3 bishops; Leary, monarch of Ireland; Dara, a king of Ulster; Cork, a king of Munster; Macnamara, an antiquarian and learned in the dialects; Fergus, a poet; and Dovach, Brehon and poet to the monarch of the country. With regard to these persons, Leary was never more than a nominal Christian, and his son was a pronounced pagan, as was also Dara, king of Ulster, and Cork, king of Munster. Fergus did not even profess to be a Christian, so that the revisers of the Brehon laws cannot have been highly charged advocates of the new religion. Returning to the text, it is beyond the scope of this work to attempt to review the Brehon Code, but it is necessary briefly to refer to some of the principles laid down in these laws, because they directly influenced the life of the early Irish. The Brehon laws were, in the first instance, administered by Druids, who were likewise the schoolmasters and genealogists of the Celtic inhabitants of Ireland. But as these laws grew more complicated, a class of men sprung up who devoted their lives to the study of the law and were known as the Brehons. The Bretons had to pass through a course of 12 years training to enable them to enter the lowest ranks of the profession. They attempted to meet all possible varieties of cases by rules, leaving no discretion to the Brehon as to the amount of damages to be awarded. For the award rested either on a decision given in an actual or in a hypothetical case, as laid down in the Brehon Code. There was no appeal from the decision of a Brehon of one rank to another of equal rank, but there might be an appeal on the grounds of sudden judgment from the decision of a Brehon to a court or council of superior Brehons, for these officers were of a different rank. A chief Brehon resided with the king of each province. The law of distress forms a large and important part of the Brehon Code. It defines the various steps by which a man who has been injured or had to recover a debt could compel the debtor to consent to appear before a Brehon to determine the merits of the case and award damages. It must be borne in mind that the early Irish had no law courts or judges who were able to enforce the law. The process consisted in the necessity which existed in a primitive society for the intervention of some extraneous influence to arbitrate between persons who were otherwise unable to settle their own differences. and further that such disputes were not simply personal matters. Individuals might disagree, but their action often implicated directly all the members of their family and of the sept to which they belonged. Individuals, as a rule, had no means of their own wherewith to pay a fine. It was from the family stock alone that a payment of this description could be met. If the offender refused to submit his case to the arbitration of a brehon or declined to meet the award given against him, the injured person proceeded, under the law of distress, to seize a certain number of cattle or other effects of the defendant after having given due notice of the action he was about to take. If cattle were thus seized, they were placed in a pound and properly cared for. The parties concerned in the action then appeared before a brehon with witnesses and all that was necessary to prove the claim. The arbitrator, having heard the case on both sides, gave judgment in accord with precedents laid down in the Brehon Code. This judgment was final, and unless the person against whom it was given or his family conformed to the decision, he was excluded from the family and sept to which he belonged. If a man low in the social scale, he might be handed over to the creditor as a slave for a specific term of years or for life. If the plaintiff happened to be a poor man who had a claim against a powerful landowner, it was possible the latter might take no heed of the demand. In cases of this description, after notice had been served by the plaintiff, if the defendant gave no pledges for appeal to arbitration, the former proceeded to, quote, fast upon his more powerful neighbour, end quote. That is, he seated himself at the door of the rich man's house and remained there without food until he received satisfaction. The Bretton Law states that, quote, he who does not give pledges to a fasting person is an evader of all. He who disregards all things shall not be paid by God or man, end quote. This system of fasting by a plaintiff at the door of the defendant is still practiced throughout India as a means of bringing a man to a sense of justice. But in spite of a safeguard of this kind, under the law of distress, the rich man had an advantage over his poorer neighbour, because the scale of damages awarded by a brehon took account of the social position of the defendant. Beyond this, as before explained, in most cases the penalty of a man's crime did not fall directly on himself, but on his family. Homicide. Under the Brehon laws, if a man committed murder, his family had to pay a fine to the relatives of the murdered man. The amount of the fine was such as the Brehon judged was sufficient to compensate the family of the murdered man for the loss they had sustained, and thus to remove their desire for revenge on the murderer. Cases of homicide were divided into two classes, the one committed without malice or forethought, the other with malice and premeditation. In the former, the fine imposed was one half less than in the latter. Heavy penalties were added if the murderer attempted to conceal the body of his victim. St. Patrick, when revising the Brehon Code, insisted on the principle of life for a life being introduced, in place of a fine to satisfy the revenge incited in the mind of the murdered man's family. The saint soon had an opportunity of putting his precepts in force, for his own charioteer was slain, and St. Patrick demanded the death of the murderer. The case was referred to the chief Brehon of Ireland, who, it seems, had previously become a Christian, and he decreed that the, quote, murderer should die, or, as the saint promised, should pass to a new life in heaven, end quote. In spite of this assurance, the Irish declined to follow St. Patrick in this matter, and so murder remained punishable by a fine, and was one of the most serious charges brought against the Brehon Code by the English lawyers of Queen Elizabeth's time. B. Judgments. It may seem strange that a large part of one of the volumes of the Brehon Code should be occupied with this subject, but bees were important beings in former times, honey being used by our ancestors in place of sugar until well into the 16th century. Under these laws, an owner of bees was obliged every 3 years to distribute a portion of his honey to his neighbours, because his bees must have gathered some of the honey from off their lands. One of the chief difficulties that arose regarding bees was with respect to swarms which had wandered beyond the land of their owners. It was assumed that the bees, to a large extent, fed on the farms to which they belonged, and that consequently a swarm, if it passed from its own grounds to a neighbour's, belonged by right to the latter. But cases of this kind were very complicated and gave rise to all manner of hypothetical and actual judgments which fill many pages of the Bretton Law tracts. The tribe, the sept, and the chief. In the Bretton Laws, the word fini is used for the family as we understand the term, that is, for the children of a living parent and their descendants. By the term sept, which is the same as the conjoint family in India, is meant the combined descendants of an ancestor long since dead and who had been one of the sons of the original chief or head of the tribe. From the footnotes, for instance, about the year AD 420, a Celtic chief called Cass settled in Clare. He became head of a tribe, the Dalcassians, or tribe or people of Cass. Cass had many sons, the eldest called Bloyd, who was the progenitor of the Sept of O'Briens. Cass's second son was called Cashin, and he was the progenitor of the Sept of Macnamaras, and so on with his other sons. Back to the text. The tribe consisted of a group or aggregate of such septs. To each sept, a specific portion of territory or tribal and common lands were assigned. The number of families and septs forming a tribe were assumed to have originally proceeded from a common ancestor, and this relationship was the chain which bound all the members of a tribe to one another. For having been derived from a common ancestor, often a man of commanding qualities, his descendants were, to a greater or less extent, bound together by congenital dispositions, and so by modes of thought and character. At the head of every tribe was a chief, who was elected by all the free men of his tribe to office. In like manner, each sept had its chief, who was also chosen by the free men of the sept to office. For example, the Macnamaras were a sept of the Dalcassian tribe, and in the year AD 1000, Brian Boru was chief of the Dalcassians and also monarch of Ireland. At the same time, a person of the name of Menma was chief of the sept known as Clan Cullen, or the aggregate of the various families of Macnamaras then living in central Clare. The members of the tribe and of its subdivision into septs and families, bound together by congenital qualities, formed a complete society, social and political. The tribe was the proprietor of everything, including the land within its own territory. Individuals as such had no property. Even kings and chiefs held the greater part of their lands by virtue of their office, and not as individuals. The chief was the recognized leader of his tribe during the time of war. He made peace or war without reference to any other authority. He led his men in battle, and as this often meant great physical exertion, fighting for hours together with a heavy battle axe, sword or lance, so the chief had necessarily to be in a perpetual state of training, and a great part of his time was occupied in athletics, in hunting, and such like manly exercises. In Clare, much attention was given to horse breeding, which engaged the chief's time. Matters connected with the collection of revenue, hospitality, and chess playing filled up the life of an Irish chief. A chief was elected to office by the free men of his tribe, or of his sept, as the case might be, and was selected, quote, next in blood that was eldest and worthiest, end quote, to the deceased chief. This principle must be clearly comprehended to enable us rightly to understand the history of these people. The title to nobility or leadership depended on the character of the man. Neither birth nor wealth could raise an individual to be leader of the tribe or sept, but his fitness only, that is, his character as appreciated by those who knew him. But it is obvious that under such a system the tribe or the sept might have been left in the midst of a battle or other emergency without a proper leader. To obviate this difficulty, when the chief was chosen, they elected a substitute chief, or tanist as he was called. The eldest son of the chief was often elected as tanist to his father, but, quote, he must be the most capable member of the family, end quote. No other claim was allowed. The ceremony of inaugurating a chief and his tanist to office was little more than the public ratification by his tribesmen of their choice, for the individual elected had invariably, by his preponderating influence and character, had been virtually recognized as leader of the sept or tribe long before the day of inauguration. If there were competitors for the office of chief, an appeal to arms was most frequently resorted to in order to settle the dispute. We shall meet with a notable example of this in the history of the family whose fortunes we have to follow. The chief of the tribe and of a sept had, in proportion to their social position, a certain quantity of land allotted to them, which they held by virtue of their office. They received tribute and certain cesses from the freemen of the tribe and sept, of which they were respectively heads. The chief of a tribe, like the Dalcassian, thus became in time owner of large flocks, which he received as the executive officer of his district. These he paid in part as tribute to the king of the province. He was bound to hospitality, to provide the means of war to a large extent, to repair roads and so on, and it was his duty to supply stock for those who required it, so that they might in their turn be able to pay tribute. The conjoined family or sept consisted of the kinsmen of a known ancestor who combined for social purposes. The members of such a family shared their goods in common. Their home was the centre of the family life, and was governed under a system of unwritten laws by an elected head or ruler, who was not only answerable for the safekeeping of the stock, but also for the good conduct of the members of his family. As there was no executive authority to enforce order in a household, the head of the family was supreme within its precincts, from which, in case of necessity, a refractory number might be expelled to become an outlaw, or in most cases a serf. A man and his wife living under such conditions would, with their children and grandchildren, soon overstock the parental home. It therefore became necessary to make provision for the rising generation. At the same time, it was impossible to expand the lands allotted to the family so that an indefinite number of the parental stock might live upon that which it could produce. Provision had to be made to meet this difficulty. In the case of the founder of a family, each of his 4 eldest sons left the parental household and settled on tribal lands, which were allotted in such quantity as to enable them to maintain themselves in a position in society equal to that of their father. If the father had more than 4 sons, one of them remained in the home and took charge of it after his father's death. If there were more than 5 sons, the others had to become retainers of their brothers or had to shift for themselves, so that the family continued to exist, but there was a direct incentive to keep it within moderate limits. A new head was substituted for the former one, and if this individual had brothers or there were other members of the family who were not in possession of sufficient lands to maintain them in their former rank, the head of the family was capable of acting for such persons as witness in court to supply bail, and was able to take the place of their father in all legal and public matters. On the death of one of the sept, the chief made a repartition of the land belonging to the family, everyone receiving his share per stirpus and not per capita. By the redistribution of the land, and by its allotment under the system of gavelkind, the descendants of the original head of a family claiming land were kept within due limits. This system was practically the same as that of the Hindu joint family of the present time. In such a family, all the property is held in common, and brought into a common purse. On the death of any one of the members of the family, the deceased's share is divided among his kindred included in the family group. Parents and children. According to the Bretton Laws, a father was obliged to provide for his daughters either in their own home or more commonly in the home of foster parents, until the girls were of marriageable age, that is, 16 or 17 years old. A father was bound to marry his daughters to men of equal rank to his own, and the son who succeeded his father as head of the house incurred similar responsibilities as regards his unmarried sisters. He was also compelled to support them if necessary in old age, sickness, or trouble. A mother, in like manner, had to provide for her sons, and they had reciprocal obligations. The laws relating to marriage portions proved that under the Bretton Laws, the rights of women were carefully protected. Unlike the Roman law, the Brehon Code demanded for the mother of a family a position equal to that of the father, and when they possessed equal property, the one could not enter into a contract concerning it without the consent of the other. We know little regarding the ceremony of marriage, if any, as practiced by the early Irish. A divorce seems to have been a matter of mutual understanding even as late as the 11th and 12th centuries. For instance, Brian Boru took himself a wife who had 2 other husbands, and when he found her too hot-tempered to be agreeable, he parted from her without ceremony. Fosterage. Our ancestors came to the conclusion that discipline, obedience to superiors, and the work which a boy or girl would have to follow in their future career was best learned away from home. They consequently sent their children, when about 7 years of age, to a relative or someone belonging to their own grade of society to be nurtured and instructed for their calling in life. The person to whom a child was thus entrusted was called his foster father, but he really stood in the same relationship to the lad made over to him as an apprentice in after years did to his master. As the life of an Irish Celt was bound up in the soil and that which grew and fed upon it, so the cultivation of the land in its various branches was the chief thing a young Irishman had to learn, and, in addition, the use of arms whereby to preserve his home from enemies, human and otherwise. To enable the foster father to fulfil his engagement, he was allowed, under the Bretton Laws, when necessary, to chastise his foster son. But it is strictly directed that, in inflicting corporal punishment, it was never to be carried to the extent of drawing blood or leaving a mark on a lad. Heavy penalties were imposed on a breach of this law. In case of illness, inability to learn, or for gross misconduct, the foster father was allowed to send the lad committed to his charge back to his parents. On the other hand, if a foster father kept the lad until he was 17 years of age, when he was always compelled to return home, and if it was then found that the lad had not become efficient in his calling, obedient and otherwise properly instructed, the foster father was heavily fined, and the amount of the fine was made over to the lad because, as the Brehon law states, it was, quote, upon him the injury of the want of learning had been inflicted. End quote. The fine to be charged in such cases was fixed by arbitrators appointed on both sides. It is evident from the chapter on fosterage which is contained in the ancient laws of Ireland that the subjects which a foster son had to acquire were immediately concerned with his material prosperity or calling. Anything beyond this was learnt in schools to which the foster father sent his charge. In these schools, before the 9th century, we have abundant evidence to show that the upper classes of Irish were taught Latin, history, and in some instances the Greek language. According to the Brehon Laws, there were 2 kinds of fosterage, one for payment, the other of affection. If for payment, the foster father received from 3 to 16 cows as a fee for training a child. The number of cows depended on the grade of society to which the parent of the child belonged. The relations between a foster child and the family of the person to whom he was entrusted were of the most intimate and enduring character. For instance, a foster father was made responsible not only for the proper education, but for any wrong done by a lad under his care. On the other hand, a foster child was bound to aid and to support his foster parents throughout life if necessary. Boys in the humbler classes of life were taught first discipline, and then how to perform the various duties of life they would subsequently have to undertake, such as herding cattle, the management of a kiln, dyeing and dressing wool, and forestry. The girls were instructed also in discipline, the use of the quern, kneading, and various other kinds of domestic work. The food of both boys and girls was prescribed by law, and consisted of stirabout, porridge, flavoured with salt butter or milk. Among the better classes, honey was added. There was abundance of fish and meat to be had, but these articles are not included in the diet roll of young people in the days of old. The sons of the higher classes were taught horsemanship, chess playing, swimming, the use of arms, and other manly exercises. They were, quote, allowed a horse to ride in the time of races, end quote. It seems that they rode their steeds barebacked and with only a piece of rope in the animal's mouth to guide him. Girls were instructed in sewing, cutting out, and in embroidery, as well as in all matters pertaining to the domestic arrangements of the household. It is certain that this system of fosterage did not weaken the tie between children and their homes and parents. On the contrary, it seems to have developed an abiding love for the parental household and its surroundings. Beyond this, fosterage engendered an intense feeling of sympathy between various classes in Ireland, knitting high and low together by sentiments often stronger than those common to blood relationship, and so having a decided effect on the social and political life of the people. Guilds. There was evidently a tendency among the early Celts of Ireland to combine for mutual protection and by cooperation to work the land for the advantage of the families who occupied it. The word gial, or pledge, is of Celtic etymology, and from it is derived our word guild. The co-partnership was formed for working the lands held by several families. In this way, a large area of grazing land could often be obtained, which was easily accessible to the cattle of several homesteads. These guilds were established under provisions laid down in the Brehon Code for, quote, the mutual benefit and assurance between the co-partners, end quote. On entering a guild, quote, each of the members turned to the others and pledged himself that the responsibilities of the united body should be the responsibility of each person, end quote. The great advantage derivable from this institution of guilds was that by combination or cooperation, persons of an inferior grade in society, and not therefore possessing land sufficient to qualify as witnesses, sureties, or to sue before the Brehons, could, by joint action, qualify one of the guild to act for them, and so obtain the full rights of citizenship. Artisans, and in fact all who lived by handicraft, could in like manner choose a member of their guild to act for them individually, so that practically no freeman was, under this ancient system, barred from the privileges of those classes of society which were above him in the social scale. It was through the guilds that villages first became established in Ireland, and subsequently developed into burghs. Of towns, the Celtic Irish knew but little. They collected in places like Limerick and Galway, but the trading community of such towns was largely constituted of foreigners, who carried on business with the agricultural population of the interior, exchanging hides and cattle for wine, silk, brocades, and various other commodities. As early as the 6th century, we hear of Gaulish merchants at Clonmacnoise on the Shannon, and in the very heart of Ireland selling wine to St. Kieran, who was at the time head of that flourishing establishment. These early Irish, however, were excellent sailors and enjoyed the perils of the deep, and still more the excitement and profit which frequently attended their marauding expeditions on the coast of England, France, and Spain. Dwellings. These were for the most part circular in form and constructed of wickerwork covered with clay or earth, over which hides, dyed of various colours, were frequently stretched. The roof was made of dried rushes and sloped from the centre outwards. We have a curious reference made to a house of this description in a poem written about AD 570 and attributed to St. Brehon. The saint, when a youth, was one day caught in a heavy shower of rain. He took refuge under an oak tree, and seeing the drops falling from the leaves, amused himself by driving his heel into the damp soil and thus making a small hollow, which was soon filled by the drops of rain from the tree. Bohin then said, of drops upon this field, of rods a round house is built. The house which is favoured of God, more and more numerous will be its family. Had I attended to my own lessons, at all times and in all places, though small my progress at a time, still I would acquire sufficient learning. It is a single rod which the man cuts, and which he weaves upon his house. The house rises pleasantly, though singly he sets the rod. The hollow which my heel hath made, be thanks to God and St. Colman, is filled in any shower by the single drop becomes a pool. I make a vow that while I live, I will not henceforth my lessons abandon. Whatever the difficulty may be to me, it is in cultivating learning, I shall always be. Among the higher classes, it was by no means uncommon to find several houses of this description enclosed within a fence and occupied by various members of the same family. In such houses, the hut inhabited by the females of the family was generally separated by a fence from that of the males. The smaller houses had no opening except the door. The smoke from the fire, which was placed near the centre of the cabin, escaped as best it could through the roof. The head of the family, with his children and the retainers, all slept on the sand floor upon a bed of dried rushes. Among the better classes, beds were used and proper covering. These were, as a rule, placed around the walls of the common room, in the centre of which was a dining table surrounded with benches. The weapons, and the leather or wooden jugs and platters belonging to the family, were arranged on shelves or hung against the walls of the house. The distaff and spinning wheel, and in many cases the loom, formed part of the household furniture. In the kitchen, which among the better classes was a separate hut, was to be found a kneading trough, griddles, tubs, and other necessary wooden vessels, together with a cooking pot varying in size with the rank and requirements of the household. A single house, or a nest of houses, as the case might be, was invariably surrounded by a well-made blackthorn hedge, and, as a rule, in addition, by a ditch and mud wall. This ring fence was directed by law to be carefully constructed, for within the enclosure was the home of the family, and no stranger might enter it without the permission of its headman. In cases of crime, the hand of the avenger was stayed at the gate of the fence surrounding the home, however poor the family might be to which it belonged. But the owner of the house was bound not to let a fugitive escape, for the law states that, quote, "He who lets a criminal escape is himself a culprit," end quote. Professor Sullivan is of opinion that the feeling thus engendered regarding the sanctity of the family home among the Irish was so strong and existed for so many generations that it has become a part of their nature, and accounts for the practice still prevalent amongst them of harbouring criminals who have thrown themselves on the protection of their relations. The law of trespass was remarkable as regards the household, and extended to the lower animals. For instance, the Bretton Laws directs that on the young pig that first goes through a fence and shows the way to the herd, a fine is imposed on the owner equal to that of one animal. If a pig trespass a second or third time, the fine was increased to the sum of 7 animals, and so with dogs and other creatures. Precisely similar customs were established under the laws of Manu. In this code we find instructions given for the family to enclose its homestead, quote, with a hedge of thorny plants, and to stop every gap through which a dog or boar could thrust its head, end quote. There is a curious reference in the Celtic law tracts regarding the construction of the fence. It was to be the work of the conjoint family, and to ensure the attendance of its members in the construction of the fence, it was enacted that, quote, each of them shall give his victuals into the hands of others at night, so that he may remember to come in the morning to his share of the continency work, and the victuals of the person that will not come may be safely consumed, end quote. The size of the precinct surrounding the house of a family was determined as follows. The owner of the premises stood at the door of his dwelling and took a spear of certain length, and so far as he could cast it, did the precincts exist. This distance was doubled for each grade as it rose in the social scale. This practice again was similar to that enjoined in the laws of Manu. The distance there denoted for the precincts is according to the length which the owner could hurl a lance. Dress and ornaments of the early Irish. In a poem of the early part of the 8th century, we have a description of the dress worn by a retainer and also that of the poet attached to a large landowner. The former wore a cape provided with a hood, and beneath this a woolen tunic reaching from the throat below the knees and confined round the waist by several folds of a scarf. This individual also wore tight-fitting pantaloons reaching from the hips to his ankles. His feet were bare. The poet had shoes made by himself, quote, from brown leather of 7 doubles, end quote. Also a petticoat or kilt, which descended to his knees. A tunic, such as that above referred to, fastened by an iron pin at the throat. Under the tunic he had a linen shirt. Among the higher classes, clothes such as those above described were replaced by richer materials, such as silk, but in other respects were of the same pattern. The brooch which confined the tunic being made of gold or silver, and frequently the workmanship displayed in these ornaments was of a high character. Many of them have been preserved until the present day as evidence of the skill and taste displayed by the early Irish in metalwork of this kind. The apparel of the women differed but little from that of the men, except that the kilt was longer. Their heads were sometimes covered with a veil, at others with a hood. Spencer states that after cutting their hair they wore, quote, a great linen roll to keep their heads warm, end quote. As a rule, in both sexes the hair of the head was allowed to grow to its natural length. This style of dress seems to have continued in use among the people of Clare as late as the end of the 16th century, for the poet Edmund Spenser, who spent some time in Ireland as secretary to the Lord Deputy, writing in AD 1596 in reference to the tunic above referred to, remarks that the Irish, quote, when wandering in waste places far from danger of law, maketh his mantle his home, and under it covereth himself from the wrath of heaven, from the offence of the earth, for it is his bed, and sight of men. When it raineth, it is his pent home. When it bloweth, it is his tent. When it freezeth, it is his tabernacle. In summer he can wear it loose, in winter he can wrap it close. At all times he can use it, never heavy, never cumbersome. Therein he wrappeth himself round, and coucheth himself strongly against the gnats, which in that country do more to annoy the naked rebels while they keep the woods, than all the enemy's swords or spears come nigh them. Oftentimes their mantle serveth them, being wrapped about the left arm instead of a target, for it is hard to cut through with a sword. Besides, it is light to bear, light to throw away, and being naked, it is to them all in all. End quote. Spencer mentions other advantages of the mantle which we need not repeat, especially to the uses which he says the women were in the habit of employing this tunic, and so he states that the government of Ireland came to the conclusion that the Irish mantle should be forbidden as an article of dress among the natives of that country. The food and drink of the early Irish. Among the poorer classes, oatmeal porridge formed the principal article of food, and when boiled in soup and properly seasoned was thought to be excellent food. With this they eat flat cakes, baked on a heated iron and made of ground filberts, acorns and barley meal. But flesh and milk was largely eaten by all classes, for there was an abundance of cattle in the land. The extensive forests were full of wild pig, deer and other game, and the rivers and sea contained an abundance of fish, and these were open to all. Watercresses were eaten as vegetables, and various kinds of seaweed. Beer was a favourite beverage, and mead, made by dissolving fermented honey in water flavoured with aromatic herbs. Well, that brings us to the end of chapter 2 of the story of an Irish Sept. In the next chapter, we're going to be introduced to yet another very important and influential class of individuals in early Ireland, the Bards, also known as the Filly and the Poet classes. We're going to learn about the schools in early Ireland that the Bards ran. We're also going to learn about the nature of military service and our dear warrior heroes from mythology, Na Fianna. We're going to learn how the early Irish cared for the poor, sick maintenance, physicians, land tenure. What was the difference between a bondsman and a freeman? And also how this system differed from feudalism. Now that Macnamara has laid a basic foundation on the Brehon law and the nature of society, it gives us a really good starting point to start building upon that with our knowledge and understanding. But if you want to learn more about the Brehon law, you're absolutely in the right place. The Brehon Academy is the channel that is putting out content that's most focused on teaching people about the Brehon law. So feel free to go onto my channel and just browse the videos there. There's plenty of content already. Some of it even goes deeper into the topics that Macnamara has just discussed in chapter 2. But if you really want to learn about the Brehon law, you have to check out the Brehon Laws of Early Ireland online course on the brehonacademy.org. Let's just take a few quick minutes so I can show you what sort of content that you'll be getting over there. After we lay a foundation that's fairly similar to what Macnamara has just laid in chapter 2 as an introduction to the Brehon Laws, we're going to get more acquainted with these individuals, the Brehons, the actual judges of early Irish people, early Irish society. We're going to ask, who are the Brehons? What were their different grades in society? The law agents. So you had like lawyers and barristers of early Ireland as well. We're going to learn about the legal manuscripts and the law schools from which they came. We have a couple of chapters there on restitution and honor price, which is, I would say, fundamental to understanding the nature of early Irish society. The idea of restitution for crime instead of retribution, and the honor price, which is something that we don't have in our modern system, but it's really interesting to get an insight into the honor price in early Ireland. This ties very, very closely into the idea of social status. Then we'll look a little bit at, I'll go deeper, should I say, into restitution by looking at how it appears in Irish mythology, how the first judgment, according to our myth in Ireland under the Partholonians, refers to restitution, how Cuchulainn got his name, and the judgment of King Cormac. Then we're going to learn more about crime, punishment, and enforcement. What was the Eric fine? What did they do in cases of murder? Then we have legal procedure. So actually learning how did people avail of legal services? What were the certain steps that they had to go through in order to get justice in early Ireland, including something that Macnamara talked about in the past chapter, but not in a lot of detail, is a concept called troscud, which can be translated as fasting for justice. It means fasting, but in this context, it's fasting for justice. We're going to learn about the contracts, pledges, and hostages and how they relate to each other. It might seem unusual at first to some people to put the concept of the topic of hostages in the same category as contracts and pledges, but we will learn why that makes sense and why this was the case. Then we have a chapter there on wider society. So we'll look at society in general, money in early Ireland and how it was connected to the cattle, hospitality, how the first copyright case ever was given in early Ireland, sick maintenance, which was briefly talked about in the past chapter by Macnamara, and how did the Bretton Laws handle mental illness. Then we have a chapter on family status and land, which is, again, really crucial to understanding the nature of early Irish society. And in this chapter, we'll also look at the status of women. We'll go a bit deeper into that. That's often a topic that people are generally aware of in relation to the Brehon Law. People often say how women had great rights under the Brehon Law. And that's relatively true, but I think it's often romanticized a little bit. So we're going to go deeper into that and understand what was the true nature and status of women in early Ireland. Then we have, in my mind, a relatively sad topic, which is the demise of the Brehon Law. What were the factors at play that ended up wiping this system off the island and out of the minds? That's the saddest part. Out of the minds of the very Irish people who once clung to these laws, to the point where so few Irish people today are able to discuss or understand how intimately connected they were to the laws of their forefathers. And then we have a couple of additional materials there at the end. So looking a little bit at how Brehon Law might change society today, and a couple of presentations that I've given in different forums. So Brehon Laws on the Hill of Ishnock, Brehon Law Past and Present was a seminar I spoke at in Trinity College, Dublin. And then Ancient Irish Anarchy is kind of a bunch of seminars where I'm discussing this concept of the stateless nature of early Ireland and how did it function without having a state or central authority to dictate how the laws should be. So check it out if that's your thing. If that sounds like something that you're interested in, I'd highly recommend it. I'm also always available to answer questions. So if anybody has any questions about anything that was covered in this chapter, please pop it in the comments below. If you like the video, please like it. If you want to see more of this content, please subscribe. Please share the link to your friends and family as well if you think they'll be interested, especially any Macnamaras and especially any O'Briens, because I think they're going to really appreciate this history of their sept. So that's it from me for tonight. Thank you so much again for your time, for being here with me on this journey. And until next time, slán go fóill.